As the night crept in, the streets of Waitekapel took on a sinister aura. The fog rolled in, shrouding the alleyways and streets in an eerie mist. The street lamps flickered, casting long, ominous shadows. The residents of Waitekapel knew that this was the time when Jack the Ripper liked to strike. The legend of the Ripper had become something of a fascination for the people of Waitekapel. They had heard the stories of the mutilated bodies and the cryptic messages left at the crime scenes. Some of them had even seen the shadowy figure moving through the alleyways, with a black coat and a top hat. It was on a night much like this that a group of friends decided to take a Jack the Ripper tour. They had heard about the famous murder sites and the ghostly sightings, and they were eager to experience the thrill of the unknown. As they made their way through the dimly lit alleyways, they felt a sense of foreboding creeping up on them. The shadows seemed to grow darker, and the mist thickened around them. They could hear the sound of footsteps, but they couldn't see who was making them. Suddenly, they saw a figure looming in the distance. He was tall and dark, with a top hat and a black coat. They froze, unsure of what to do. As the figure got closer, they could see the madness in his eyes. It was Jack the Ripper. The friends tried to run, but they were too late. Jack the Ripper was upon them, his razor-sharp knife glinting in the moonlight. They screamed and struggled, but it was no use. Jack the Ripper was too strong, too powerful. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The friends were left standing in the alleyway, trembling and shaken. They had narrowly escaped the clutches of Jack the Ripper, but they knew that they had been marked by him. From that day on, they were haunted by the ghostly figure of Jack the Ripper. They would see him in their dreams, his eyes glowing with madness. They would hear the sound of his footsteps in the darkness, and they would feel his razor-sharp knife at their throats. For the friends, the legend of Jack the Ripper had become a terrifying reality. They knew that they could never escape his grasp, no matter how far they ran or how well they hid. They were forever bound to the streets of Waitekapel, haunted by the ghostly figure of the Ripper. The friends tried to forget about the terrifying encounter, but they could not shake the feeling of being watched. They saw the figure of Jack the Ripper everywhere they went, lurking in the shadows and watching them with his piercing gaze. One of the friends, a young woman named Sophie, began to experience strange occurrences at home. She would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling a cold breeze and hearing the sound of footsteps. She would see the figure of Jack the Ripper standing at the foot of her bed, his eyes glowing in the darkness. Sophie tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, but she knew deep down that it was something more. She started to research the history of Waitekapel and the legend of Jack the Ripper, hoping to find some answers. As she delved deeper into the mystery, Sophie began to uncover a dark and sinister truth. There were rumors that Jack the Ripper had made a deal with the devil, trading his soul for eternal life. He had become a spectral being, haunting the streets of Waitekapel and preying on unsuspecting victims. Sophie knew that she had to do something to protect herself. Sophie became obsessed with finding a way to defeat the ghostly figure of Jack the Ripper. She visited spiritualists and psychics, hoping to get some insight into the supernatural realm. She even went as far as to perform a ritual in an attempt to communicate with the spirits and to find a way to banish Jack the Ripper. But her attempts were in vain. The ghostly figure of Jack the Ripper continued to haunt her, his presence growing stronger with each passing day. Sophie knew that she was running out of time. Desperate for help, Sophie reached out to a group of paranormal investigators. They were known for their expertise in investigating supernatural phenomena and had successfully dealt with numerous cases of hauntings and possessions. The investigators agreed to take on Sophie's case and set up their equipment in her home. They began to conduct a series of tests and experiments, hoping to capture some evidence of Jack the Ripper's presence. As the night wore on, the investigators' equipment began to register unusual readings. There were strange fluctuations in temperature, unexplained noises, and even apparitions caught on camera. But the most chilling discovery was a series of scratch marks on the walls of Sophie's bedroom, each one resembling the mark of a razor blade. The investigators concluded that Jack the Ripper was indeed haunting Sophie, and that his presence was growing more powerful with each passing day. They advised Sophie to leave the house immediately and to seek professional help. Sophie did as she was told, and the investigators began a series of rituals to banish Jack the Ripper. They burned sage, chanted incantations, and even performed an exorcism. And finally, after hours of intense work, the ghostly figure of Jack the Ripper vanished. Sophie returned to her home, grateful for the help of the investigators. But she knew that the memory of Jack the Ripper would always haunt her. She could still see his figure in the shadows, still hear his footsteps in the darkness. The legend of Jack the Ripper continues to haunt the streets of Waitekapel, with many people claiming to have seen his ghostly figure lurking in the shadows. And for Sophie, the memory of her encounter with Jack the Ripper will stay with her forever, a chilling reminder of the dark side of human nature and the horrors that lurk in the unknown. Sophie's encounter with Jack the Ripper had left her deeply shaken. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, and she saw the ghostly figure of the Ripper everywhere she went. It was as if he had marked her, and he was determined to haunt her for the rest of her days. Sophie became obsessed with the legend of Jack the Ripper. She read every book and article she could find on the subject, hoping to find some insight into the mind of the man who had terrorized Waitekapel. She even visited the sites of the murders, hoping to get a sense of the ghostly presence that still lingered there. As Sophie continued her research, she began to uncover new information about the case. She found reports of other supernatural occurrences in Whitecapel, all of which seemed to be connected to the legend of Jack the Ripper. There were stories of phantom footsteps, disembodied voices, and ghostly apparitions. Some people even claimed to have seen the ghostly figure of the Ripper himself, wandering the streets and alleys of Whitecapel. Sophie knew that she had to do something to protect herself from the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper. She began to study the occult, hoping to find a way to banish the spirit and bring peace to her life. She read ancient grimoires, practiced rituals, and even consulted with spiritualists and mediums, but nothing seemed to work. The ghostly figure of Jack the Ripper continued to haunt her, his presence growing more intense with each passing day. As the days turned into weeks, Sophie began to lose hope. She felt as though she was being consumed by the darkness, as if the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper was slowly taking over her mind and body. One day, as Sophie was walking home from the library, she saw a shadowy figure moving in the distance. It was the figure of a man, tall and dark, with a black coat and a top hat. Sophie froze, her heart racing with fear. She knew that it was the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper. The figure drew closer, and Sophie could see the madness in his eyes. She tried to run, but her legs felt heavy and sluggish. The figure was upon her in an instant, his razor-sharp knife glinting in the moonlight. Sophie screamed and struggled, but it was no use. The ghostly figure of Jack the Ripper was too strong, too powerful. He held her in his grip, his eyes glowing with a sinister light. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. Sophie was left standing in the darkness, trembling and shaken. She knew that the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper was becoming more powerful, and that she was running out of time. Determined to find a way to banish the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper, Sophie decided to seek out the help of a group of paranormal investigators. They were known for their expertise in investigating supernatural phenomena, and she was hopeful that they could help her. The investigators arrived at Sophie's home, armed with an array of equipment and tools. They began to conduct a series of tests and experiments, hoping to capture some evidence of the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper. As the night wore on, the investigators' equipment began to register unusual readings. There were strange fluctuations in temperature, unexplained noises, and even apparitions caught on camera. The investigators concluded that the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper was indeed haunting Sophie, and that his presence was growing more powerful with each passing day. They advised Sophie to leave her home immediately and to seek professional help. Sophie did as she was told, and the investigators began a series of rituals to banish the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper. They burned sage, chanted incantations, and even performed an exorcism. And finally, after hours of intense work, the ghostly figure of Jack the Ripper vanished. Sophie was filled with a sense of relief and gratitude. She knew that the investigators had saved her from the clutches of the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper. As she left her home, Sophie looked back at the empty space where the ghostly figure of Jack the Ripper had once stood. She knew that she would never forget the horror of her experience, but she felt a sense of closure knowing that the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper was finally gone. However, Sophie's relief was short-lived. She soon began to experience strange occurrences once again. She heard strange noises in the middle of the night and saw shadowy figures moving in the darkness. She knew that the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper was still with her and that he was more powerful than ever before. Sophie felt as though she was losing her mind. She couldn't sleep, she couldn't eat, and she felt as though she was being consumed by the darkness. She knew that she had to do something to stop the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper from taking over her life once and for all. She returned to the investigators and begged for their help. They agreed to take on her case once again and began a new series of rituals to banish the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper for good. The investigators spent days preparing for the ritual. They gathered an array of mystical objects and artifacts and called upon the power of the divine to help them in their quest. As the night of the ritual approached, Sophie felt a sense of trepidation. She knew that the stakes were high and that the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper was more powerful than ever before. The night of the ritual was dark and stormy. The investigators gathered in a circle around Sophie and began to chant ancient incantations. They called upon the power of the spirits and the divine and hoped that their efforts would be enough to banish the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper for good. As the ritual progressed, Sophie began to feel a strange sensation. She felt as though she was being lifted up, as if she was floating in the air. She closed her eyes and let herself go, surrendering to the power of the ritual. And then, all of a sudden, there was a blinding light. Sophie felt as though she was being pulled into a vortex, as if she was being transported to another dimension. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in the middle of a field, surrounded by a halo of light. She knew that she had been transported to a different realm, a realm beyond time and space. In the distance, she saw a shadowy figure moving toward her. It was the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper, more powerful and terrifying than ever before. Sophie knew that she had to act quickly. She closed her eyes and focused her mind, calling upon the power of the spirits and the divine. She chanted ancient incantations and felt the power of the universe flowing through her. And then, all of a sudden, there was a blinding light. Sophie felt as though she was being lifted up, as if she was being transported to another realm. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her own world. The ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper was gone, banished to a realm beyond time and space. Sophie knew that she had triumphed over the darkness, and that she had finally found peace. She knew that the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper would never haunt her again, and that she could finally move on with her life. As she walked away from the investigators, she felt a sense of relief and gratitude. She knew that she would never forget the horror of her experience, but she felt a sense of closure knowing that the ghostly presence of Jack the Ripper was finally gone. The legend of Jack the Ripper continues to haunt the streets of Waitekapel, with many people claiming to have seen his ghostly figure lurking in the shadows. But for Sophie, the nightmare was finally over.